Trump's tariff war with Canada is unraveling, and the signs are everywhere that his economic bullying has spectacularly backfired. While Industry Minister Melanie Joly calmly announced that Canada-U.S. trade negotiations are going ahead in the right direction, the reality behind these diplomatic words tells a much more damaging story for the former president turned current economic disruptor. What we're witnessing isn't just failed policy. It's the systematic collapse of Trump's signature trade strategy, and the consequences are hitting American consumers, businesses, and workers harder than anyone anticipated. To understand how badly Trump's tariff gambit has blown up in his face, we need to examine what's actually happening beneath the surface of these so-called successful negotiations. Then Prime Minister Mark Carney met with Trump in Washington this week. It wasn't a meeting between equals. It was a desperate attempt by Trump to salvage a trade war that's causing more damage to American interests than Canadian ones. The meeting marks Carney's second visit to the White House since becoming Prime Minister earlier this year, with a trading relationship worth $900 billion on the line. The former central banker won an election in April on a promise to negotiate a new trade and security deal with the U.S., but Trump has only hiked tariffs on Canadian products since then. When asked about the outcome of these discussions, we find out what exactly Trump means by these vague promises. His response reveals the emptiness behind his negotiating stance. Meanwhile, Industry Minister Melanie Joly has been discussing the ongoing negotiations, revealing that Canada is pursuing deals on steel, aluminum, and energy projects while continuing to fight for every job in the auto sector.
So listen, I won't go into the details of the negotiation. What you heard from the Prime Minister is at this point is we're looking to have a deal on steel, aluminum, and also energy projects. So this is what is being worked on. But we know also that we need one on auto, and we need one on copper, and we need one also on lumber, because these are all tariff industries. So we're going into an approach where we are doing one at a time. But at the same time, we will continue to fight for our auto workers. That's clear.
I do want to, though, based on what you just said, in combination with what we heard from Howard Lutnick, ask you about the prospect of one. I understand that you don't want to, disclose the details of the negotiations, but do I take from what you just said and what we heard from the Prime Minister that there won't be any deal on autos anytime soon? Howard Lutnick was pretty much explicit that Canada, he said, should come second to the United States, that maybe they'll continue buying parts, but nothing really beyond that. Is that your understanding? And if so, how consequential is that?
Well, I think the only person in the U.S. administration that decides is the president himself. So you saw a positive meeting this week between the Prime Minister and the president. The tone was respectful, and obviously the president directed his team to work with our team to make sure ultimately that we'll land on a deal. And the challenge that the Prime Minister of Canada has, and any leader...
She emphasizes that President Trump is the ultimate decision maker and describes the recent meeting as positive and respectful, with Trump directing his team to work toward a deal. But at the end of the day, there was no reduction, no elimination of tariffs.
But at the end of the day, there was nothing substantial to announce, no reduction, no elimination of tariffs. Instead, Trump asked both the Canadian and U.S. officials to keep negotiating with a special focus on cross-border trade in steel, aluminum, and energy, and Trump said he wants them to do this quickly. And
Instead, Trump asked both the Canadian and U.S. officials to keep negotiating with a special focus on cross-border trade in steel, aluminum, and energy. And Trump said he wants them to do this quickly. The devastating truth Trump doesn't want Americans to know is this. While he's been threatening and posturing, Canada has been systematically reducing its dependence on U.S. trade, and it's working brilliantly. Take Aluminary Alouette, a Quebec aluminum manufacturing company, which sent 4% of its entire export to Europe in the first quarter of this fiscal year. In the second quarter, that figure was 57%, according to a report from Bloomberg. Think about that staggering transformation. In just 3 months, a major Canadian aluminum manufacturer shifted 53% of its exports away from the United States to Europe. This isn't just one company, it's a systematic reorientation of Canadian trade away from an increasingly unreliable American market. Trump himself has described the situation as more complicated than any other agreement we have on trade, citing both natural conflict and mutual love between the nations.
Considering that we're allies, considering the closest of the U.S.-Canada relationship, Eric, for so many years, this long history, but Trump's saying, it's the closeness, according to Trump, that he says makes it so hard to make this deal, which seems counterintuitive. He goes on to say it's a complicated agreement, more complicated maybe than any other agreement we have on trade because, we have a natural conflict. We also have mutual love. I don't understand how Prime Minister Carney could even kind of grasp where Canada is at when you hear, on the one hand this, but on the one hand that, on the one hand this, on the one hand that. We know this is classic Trump, but it's like a lot of love, but not a lot of connection when it comes to deal making.
This paradox, Eichel's statement perfectly illustrates the challenges and showcases Trump's unpredictable diplomatic style. The numbers behind Trump's tariff disaster are even more damaging than most Americans realize. The tariffs amount to an average tax increase of nearly $1,300 per U.S. household in 2025. That's not a one-time cost. That's an annual burden Trump has imposed on American families, making everyday goods more expensive while claiming to protect American jobs. But the protection isn't materializing, and the costs keep mounting. Meanwhile, Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs, his supposed crown jewel of trade policy, are devastating American companies that rely on these materials. Michael Garcia, CEO of Algoma Steel, told CBC about Trump's 50% tariff, which has effectively closed the U.S. market to them. The cruel irony is that while Trump's tariffs are supposed to help American steel companies, they're actually making American manufacturers less competitive by forcing them to pay artificially inflated prices for steel inputs. It's economic self-sabotage disguised as economic nationalism. The broader economic analysis reveals just how catastrophically Trump's tariff strategy has misfired. Canada's GDP would shrink by 2.6%, or roughly 78 billion Canadian dollars, costing Canadians approximately $1,900 per person annually. U.S. GDP would shrink by 1.6%, or roughly 467 billion US dollars, costing Americans approximately $1,300 per person annually. These aren't theoretical projections. They're the real economic consequences of Trump's trade war, and they show that while both countries suffer, the damage to the U.S. economy in absolute terms is massive. History has taught us this lesson before. As former President Ronald Reagan himself warned, high tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars, followed by market collapse, business shutdowns, and mass unemployment.
And his thoughts on tariffs. Have a listen to this.
High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. Then the worst happens. Markets shrink and collapse, businesses and industries shut down, and millions of people lose their jobs.
Ontario's government is now using Reagan's own words to remind Americans of this fundamental economic truth. But the most damaging aspect of Trump's failed tariff strategy isn't just the immediate economic costs. It's how it's fundamentally undermining American strategic interests. These tariffs will harm the Trump administration's goal of developing more secure supply chains and competing with China. Continuing to make progress here will require greater trade and investment across North America to strengthen and diversify existing supply chains and reduce reliance on China-centered supply chains. The tariffs are directly at odds with deeper economic integration across North America. In fact, China will benefit from a trade war across North America as it undercuts efforts to reshore supply chains away from China. This is perhaps the most devastating indictment of Trump's approach. While claiming to be tough on China, his tariffs on Canada and Mexico are actually helping China by weakening North American economic integration. As one trade expert described it, this has become a Mexican standoff where nobody wins and everybody loses.
Well, that's an interesting issue. One way to look at this is if you look at what the US side needs and what the Chinese are threatening, rare earths are an immediate need for the United States. If you don't have rare earths, you don't have a lot of products, including military products. On the other hand, with the Chinese want technology. They want the top chips that the United States has. That is a prospective need for the Chinese to be able to develop artificial intelligence. So when you look at the key things that both sides need, you could argue that the Chinese have the upper hand. But when we start getting to the level of tariffs that Trump is talking about, this is basically what popularly we could call a Mexican standoff, where nobody wins.
The situation perfectly captures the futility of Trump's approach. The legal challenges to Trump's tariff authority add another layer of humiliation to this policy disaster. According to Thomson Reuters, the CIT found the IEEPA tariffs illegal because the triggering emergency, fentanyl trafficking, and trade deficits bore no rational connection to the trade measures imposed. Federal courts have essentially ruled that Trump's justification for these tariffs is legally nonsensical. The manufacturing sector data reveals another dimension of Trump's tariff failure. Economic analysts forecast that tariffs imposed during the Trump administration could push the unemployment rate to recession levels. Since importing companies bear the cost of tariffs, which can raise business costs, one way to control expenses is by cutting jobs. Federal data indicate that the manufacturing sector lost a net total of 14,000 jobs in May and June combined. So much for protecting American jobs. Trump's tariffs are actually destroying them. The international response to Trump's tariff tantrum has been swift and devastating. Retaliation by other countries is indeed another danger of pulling the tariff lever. Higher tariffs on American exports would typically raise their prices for foreign consumers, hitting demand for the goods in many cases. When Trump announced new tariffs this year, America's major trading partners were quick to strike back with their own levies, although the U.S. then agreed a temporary truce with China and the European Union. The fact that Trump had to negotiate truces shows how badly his tariff strategy backfired. You don't negotiate truces when you're winning. Canada's response has been particularly masterful in exposing Trump's weakness. Officials in Ottawa are conscious of Trump's political vulnerabilities, including his commitment to keeping consumer costs low for Americans, and his devotion to U.S. states, regions, and sectors that have provided him with political support. Because Canada is the principal export destination for 34 U.S. states, Ottawa has ample opportunities to target its own retaliatory tariffs with precision. Canadian policymakers designed counter tariffs with these vulnerabilities in mind. This is economic chess versus economic checkers. While Trump swings wildly with broad tariffs that hurt American consumers, Canada is surgically targeting retaliatory measures to hit Trump's political base where it hurts most. Even without these countermeasures, Trump's now suspended 25% import tariff would cost the typical U.S. household $1,200 per month, according to Yale University's Budget Lab. The political ramifications of Trump's tariff disaster extend far beyond economics. His threats appear to have activated a latent but powerful nationalism in Canada. President Trump has often repeated his call for Canada to become the 51st state. Such statements, coupled with threats of economic force, have been received by most Canadians not as an invitation, but as an assault on Canada's economy and sovereignty. Trump's bullying tactics have united Canadians against him across party lines, making future negotiations even more difficult. The lumber industry provides another perfect example of Trump's tariff strategy backfiring. On September 30th, the president issued a proclamation announcing that he would be imposing 10% tariffs on lumber effective October 14th. The rates on upholstered furniture would increase to 30% on January 1st, 2026, and the rates on kitchen cabinets and bathroom vanities would increase to 50% on that date. These aren't targeted measures to address specific trade issues. They're desperate attempts to extract concessions through economic coercion, and they're making American construction and furniture more expensive. The broader pattern is clear. Trump's tariff strategy has failed on every measurable level. It hasn't brought manufacturing jobs back to America. It's actually destroying them. It hasn't made American companies more competitive. It's made them less competitive by raising their input costs. It hasn't strengthened America's negotiating position. It's weakened it by forcing the U.S. into defensive positions in multiple simultaneous trade disputes. Most damaging of all, Trump's tariff war has accelerated exactly the outcome he claimed to be preventing: the reduced importance of the American market in global trade. Canadian companies that rely on cross-border supply chains will face logistical and financial challenges. Businesses will likely see reduced demand from U.S. buyers due to increased prices, slowing overall economic growth in Canada. With many U.S. businesses relying on Canadian imports, tariffs on Canadian goods and materials will raise prices considerably for American businesses and consumers, leading to inflationary pressures in the U.S. The ultimate irony is that while Trump claims his tariffs are about making America stronger, they're actually making America more isolated and less relevant in global trade. Countries are actively seeking alternatives to American markets, American suppliers, and American trade relationships. More broadly, because these tariffs are most likely inconsistent with USMCA, they signal to the world that any international agreement with the U.S. is unreliable when Trump is involved. As we look at the current state of Canada-U.S. trade talks, the real story isn't about negotiations moving in the right direction. It's about Trump desperately trying to salvage a failed policy that has damaged American economic interests, strengthened America's competitors, and alienated America's closest allies. The tariff war that was supposed to demonstrate American strength has instead revealed American weakness, and the consequences will be felt long after these particular negotiations conclude. Trump's tariff strategy hasn't just failed, it's backfired so spectacularly that it's become a case study in how not to conduct trade policy. And while diplomatic language may soften the edges of this reality, the numbers don't lie. Trump's tariffs are a disaster for American workers, American consumers, and American competitiveness. The only question now is how much more damage they'll do before this failed experiment finally ends.